So you finally did it, you got yourself fired. The words hit the kitchen like a thrown plate. There was no softness, no pause for breath. Just the blunt, flat delivery of a man who had already decided what I was to him, an inconvenience. I stood in the middle of our open-plan kitchen. The grocery bag still in my hands, the evening light pooling on the quartz counter. My pulse thudded loud enough that I wondered if he could hear it. It felt like every small noise in the apartment amplified, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint traffic from the street, the soft tick of the wall clock. I didn't get fired, I said, too quietly. They did some cuts at work. It wasn't cuts, Dylan repeated with a laugh that had no humor. Is that what they're calling it now? Grace, come on. He leaned back against the kitchen island, arms crossed, and looked at me like I was a mistake he'd tolerated for far too long. You can't even keep a job. How are we supposed to what? I cut in, breath catching. Pay the mortgage? Keep the kids' college funds? Oh wait, we don't have kids. He ignored the jolt in my voice. Maybe if you weren't so soft with everything, you'd actually hold down something real. Soft. That word stung in a place I didn't even realize existed. Soft for trying to make our life cozy. Soft for listening to him when he had stress. Soft for folding his shirts, for learning how he liked his coffee. All the things that, in another marriage, would have been called partnership. Not here. Not with him. When I first married Dylan, he was the kind of man who noticed small things, a cracked mug, a new framed photo, how I liked the bedroom window left open. He called them details. He called me attentive. Over 10 years, the details accumulated into rituals: Sunday pancakes, late-night design sketches spread over the dining table, the way he'd hum off-key while fixing something. Those rituals had become our life. Lately, the rituals felt like props in a stage play I didn't know I was in. He had changed gradually enough I could always explain it away: busy season, tight deadlines, stress. But there were signs. The way he'd leave his phone face down more often. The sudden conferences that popped up with suspicious regularity. The perfume I smelled once on his collar that wasn't mine. I told myself I was anxious. I told myself I was being dramatic. So when I was offered the promotion, senior project manager at the firm I'd poured a decade into, I should have felt electrified. Instead, I felt oddly small. The congratulatory emails, the firm handshake from the principal, the toast at the office party, all of it sat in my stomach like a stone. On the walk home that day I kept the promotion letter in my bag, but I didn't want to announce it. A part of me wanted to test the loyalties in our house. Who was my husband under pressure? Who was Dylan if he wasn't the convenient comfort he'd grown into? It seemed petty, to some ears. But trust erodes in tiny increments. You don't notice that the cliff is ahead until you're standing on the edge. I told myself I would keep my secret small, a private experiment to see if he still had the small tenderness I used to get when I burned a batch of pancakes. I expected a little surprise, maybe a hug, maybe a proud look. Not that. Not the contempt. You should start applying somewhere else, he said as if reciting a household ordinance. Maybe find something you can actually manage. I can't keep bailing you out. Bail me out. I stood there, feeling the word as if he'd thrown it at my feet. For the first time, the idea that I'd been married to a stranger dawned like a cold light. The man who had once promised to stand by me was lecturing me on my worth as if he'd been appointed arbiter, that night. He closed himself in his study and retreated into whatever little world shields men like him from seeing the hurt they cause. I sat on the sofa with the letter tucked inside my bag like contraband. The television murmured a hollow sitcom in the background. I could have shown him the letter then, pulled it from my bag and watched his face change. Prove him wrong in one clean, theatrical moment. But doing so would be an appeal to the very thing that had hurt me, seeking his validation. Instead, I slid the letter into a folder in the bottom drawer of the hall console. I locked the drawer. When I locked it, it felt less like theft and more like setting aside something precious until the time was right. The next morning, Dylan kissed my cheek, mumbling about being late for a meeting. "Don't wait up," he called over his shoulder. The familiarity felt like salt on a fresh wound. He never looked at me the way I saw myself. Not anymore. He wasn't the man who would worry if I'd eaten. He was the man who judged whether I was useful. I let him go, and when the door clicked shut, I breathed. For the first time in a long while, clarity cleared the fog. My marriage had become a ledger, entries to balance, duties assigned with curt efficiency. I had been performing the role of devoted wife until that performance was no longer appreciated. Later that week I opened his laptop, a transgression I told myself was only for answers. His email was curated, recent messages, but the usual chatter absent. Deleted threads. I clicked one lingering draft and felt an ache I couldn't name. A text preview glowed on the screen while he turned away to make coffee. "Sophie, I miss you. When can we talk?" I felt it like a physical shove. Sophie. A name that should be nothing to me, and suddenly it had weight. Not a surprise, which makes the reality both worse and more precise. a man who said I do once had room for an entire second life. The rain started up as if the world had decided to weep along with me. I watched it beat on the glass like little prisms, thinking of years of folding laundry, of late-night edits, of plans for a future that, perhaps, had always been a collage of his convenience. When he came home that night, smelling faintly of whiskey, he didn't notice my change. He kissed the air near my cheek, mumbled "hey," and headed for the shower. His phone buzzed and lit up on the counter, another message I didn't need to open. I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I only sat in the quiet of our kitchen, the letter still locked in the drawer, and felt a startling clarity. This experiment had yielded a truth that would change everything. I ran my hand along the drawer's edge and whispered to the empty room. If you're hiding things, Dylan, I'll find them. It wasn't bravado. It was the steady resolve of someone who had been underestimated for too long. If someone had told me 10 years ago that my marriage would become a performance, I would have laughed. Back then, Dylan Carter was the kind of man who filled a room just by walking into it, confident, funny, charming in that effortless way people mistake for kindness. When we first met, he'd been building his own engineering startup, full of big dreams and late-night sketches on coffee napkins. I was an interior designer, working freelance jobs out of my tiny apartment in Boston. He used to come by after work, eat takeout on my couch, and talk about the future like it was a country we'd both move to someday. He told me I made him feel steady. I told him he made me feel seen. Maybe that's where the lie began. When being seen started to mean being managed, our wedding was small, elegant, held at a lakeside and surrounded by autumn trees. Everyone said we looked perfect. My mother called Dylan the dream son-in-law. He had that easy smile that convinced people he was always in control. For a while, we were happy, or maybe I just believed we were. We bought a modest house outside Seattle with an open kitchen and a view of the river. The kind of house that photographs well on social media, white walls, modern furniture, a life curated for comfort. I filled it with soft light and color. He filled it with rules. Dylan had a way of assigning himself authority over everything. How the bills were paid. Which friends were good influences. How many hours I should work so I didn't burn out. At first, I thought he was just being protective. But protection without trust becomes control. Little by little, I adjusted to his expectations. I stopped questioning why he stayed late at work, or why his phone was always face down. He'd shrug and say, "Clients," in a tone that suggested I was ridiculous for even asking. Sometimes, at dinner, I'd talk about a new project or a client's praise, and he'd respond with that polite half-smile. "That's nice, babe. But remember, don't get too comfortable. You've had a good run." It was his favorite phrase, "You've had a good run." Like every accomplishment I made was temporary, a borrowed victory until something went wrong again. There were still moments when I thought maybe we were fine. Sunday mornings, coffee steaming, the smell of pancakes, the radio humming low. He'd kiss my forehead and ask what I wanted for the weekend. But those moments never lasted. They felt scripted, small acts of maintenance to keep up appearances, and I played along. I posted anniversary photos, tagged him in cheerful captions, smiled at his coworkers at parties. The perfect couple. The polished life. Behind the photos, we barely spoke. He stopped asking about my day. I stopped volunteering answers. Our conversations became transactions. Did you pay the bill? What time's your meeting? Pick up milk. Sometimes silence is louder than shouting. It was during one of those silent dinners that the first real fracture appeared. I'd been telling him about a client who wanted to redo her entire house in minimalist whites. Dylan was scrolling through his phone, barely listening. Then, without looking up, he said, "You know, maybe you should slow down a bit. You've been too distracted lately." "Distracted?" I asked. He shrugged. "You've been forgetting things. The laundry. Groceries. It's not like you to be careless." It wasn't the words that hurt, it was the way he said them. Casual and cruel, as if I were a faulty appliance that needed adjustment. That night, I stayed awake long after he fell asleep, watching the shadows shift on the ceiling. I realized I couldn't remember the last time he'd apologized for anything. There were other signs too, subtle, but persistent. He started keeping a second phone. I noticed it once, charging in his office drawer. When I asked, he said it was a work line. I believed him, because I wanted to. He started wearing cologne he never used before. Changed his passwords. Booked weekend, site visits, that didn't show up on his calendar. When I told my best friend Maya about it, she said, "Grace, that doesn't sound normal." I laughed it off. It's just a rough patch. Every couple has them. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a patch. It was a pattern. Point. One evening, when he came home late again, I decided to ask directly. "Is there something you're not telling me?" He froze halfway through loosening his tie. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You've been different," I said. "You barely talk to me anymore." He let out a slow exhale, the kind people use before delivering a line they've rehearsed. Grace, you always overthink everything. Not everything has to be drama. Then he kissed the top of my head, a gesture meant to soothe, but it only burned. When he left the room, I stood there, numb. It wasn't the first time he'd gaslit me into silence, but it was the first time I didn't immediately fold. I started noticing details I'd once ignored. A lipstick stain on a receipt tucked in his jacket pocket. A hotel charge from a weekend I'd spent visiting my sister. A sudden interest in the gym, not for health, but for appearances. One night, while cleaning, I found a crumpled napkin in his coat with a phone number scrawled on it. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, and unfamiliar. The name written beside it, Sophie. At that point, denial wasn't possible anymore. I didn't confront him then. I wanted to see how far he'd go. People always say marriages end with a fight, a slammed door, a broken vow. Ours was ending quietly, behind polite smiles and the clink of wine glasses. In public, we looked perfect. At home, we lived in separate worlds connected by walls and habit. He had stopped being my husband. And I had stopped being the woman he could underestimate. The night I told him I'd lost my job, I wasn't lying to trap him. I was lying to wake myself up. I just didn't realize how right I'd been, or how dark the truth beneath that marriage really was. For days after that argument, the house felt like it had been emptied of air. The sound of Dylan's voice lingered in the walls like smoke after a fire. Every word he'd thrown at me replayed over and over. Maybe this will teach you to stop acting like you're irreplaceable. At first, I told myself to move on. That it was just a fight. That maybe, deep down, he hadn't meant it. I tried to focus on work, on my secret promotion. On anything that reminded me there was still a version of my life untouched by his bitterness, but silence has a way of stretching. Of settling into the corners of a room until it becomes unbearable. Every night, Dylan would come home late. He'd drop his keys on the counter, mumble, "Hey," and disappear into his office. I'd hear the click of his laptop, the soft murmur of his voice, sometimes laughter. Sometimes a hushed tone that made my skin crawl. One evening, around midnight, I was lying in bed when I heard his office door creak open. The floorboards gave their usual protest under his feet. I closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep, my heart beating too loudly in my chest. Then I heard it, his voice, low and careful. "No, she doesn't suspect anything yet." The words sliced through the dark like glass. I stayed still. Every muscle frozen, afraid even my breathing would give me away. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. Then came a soft chuckle. "Of course not. She's naive. Always has been. Just give me a few more weeks." A few more weeks for what? My stomach tightened. I listened as he whispered something about timing and documents. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes. But it felt like an eternity, every syllable another thread unraveling in the tapestry of our life. When he finally hung up, I heard him sigh, shuffle papers, and go back into the office. The door clicked shut. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my pulse wild. No. She doesn't suspect anything yet. He was wrong. I got up quietly, walked barefoot to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water I didn't drink. My hands were shaking. The air in the house felt heavy, like it was holding a secret of its own. I wanted to believe he was talking about something harmless. A work project. A surprise. Something simple. Anything but what my instincts were screaming. But the truth is, intuition rarely lies. We just spend our lives learning how to silence it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with the lights off, watching the rain trace lines down the window. I thought of every late night, every missing receipt, every phone call that ended when I entered the room. All the things I had brushed aside as paranoia. I wasn't paranoid. I was patient. The next morning, Dylan was cheerful, unnervingly so. He made coffee, whistled off-key, kissed the top of my head as if we hadn't fought days ago. "You feeling better?" he asked. I nodded, keeping my voice light. "Yeah. Just tired." He smiled. "You'll land on your feet, Grace. You always do." It would have sounded kind if I didn't already know it came from a place of condescension. He left soon after, briefcase in hand, humming as he went out the door. The moment it clicked shut, I sat down at the table and let the mask fall. My hands trembled as I stared at his empty coffee mug, the one with the chip he refused to throw away. How many mornings had I watched him sip from it, believing we were okay? By noon, I'd made a decision. If Dylan was hiding something, I'd find out. I started small, checking the trash for receipts, noticing patterns in his schedule, watching for the way his expression shifted when his phone buzzed. It was subtle at first, changes that most people wouldn't notice. But I'd been married to this man for a decade. I knew the difference between his real smile and the one he used as armor. He began staying out later, always with excuses that sounded perfectly reasonable. A new client, a last-minute meeting, traffic. Once, I called him around 8:30 p.m. He didn't pick up. A few minutes later, he texted, "In a meeting. Talk later," except when I checked the GPS tracker on our shared car insurance app. something he'd probably forgotten existed. It pinged a location near the waterfront. Not his office. A small boutique hotel. My hands went cold. That weekend, he suggested we go to dinner, something we hadn't done in weeks. I booked a reservation at that new place downtown, he said. Let's dress up a bit, yeah? It sounded innocent, almost sweet. For a second, I wondered if maybe he was trying to make up for everything. At dinner, he was attentive, too attentive. He asked about my job search, my plans, my next move. It felt rehearsed, like a script. Then, halfway through his steak, he said, maybe this whole thing is for the best. You've been under a lot of pressure. You could use some time off. I set my fork down slowly. Time off from what, exactly? He smiled, sipping his wine. From all of this. He waved vaguely around the table, around the restaurant, around our marriage. Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I knew that tone. It was the same tone people used right before a breakup. Right before cutting a deal they'd been preparing behind your back. That night, when we got home, I caught him typing something on his phone. His expression tight. I stepped into the hallway quietly. Just far enough to hear him whisper, yeah, everything's going according to plan. The words sank into me like stones. For the first time in years, fear wasn't my dominant feeling. It was focused. I realized that if I confronted him now, he'd lie. He'd twist everything. He was too good at that. So I smiled when he came to bed. I played the role he thought I'd play, because the moment he believed I was still that naive, obedient wife, that would be the moment he'd lose. There's a certain kind of silence that feels alive, like it's listening, waiting. That morning, I woke up with a plan. I would call in sick, stay home, and see what Dylan did when he thought I wasn't watching. It was a Wednesday. He was halfway through his second cup of coffee when I said, I'm not feeling well today. I think I'll stay home and rest. He looked up from his phone just long enough to nod. Sure. Don't push yourself. That was all. No concern, no offer to help, no warmth. Just efficiency. He grabbed his keys, kissed the air near my cheek, and left. The door clicked, the car started, and I stood there, staring at the empty hallway. I waited 10 minutes before I moved. I needed to be sure. Then I turned off my phone, dimmed the lights, and sat on the couch with a blanket thrown over me, pretending to nap. If he really was hiding something, I knew sooner or later, the truth would knock. It didn't take long. Around noon, the sound of the front door unlocking startled me. My pulse jumped. I peeked through the crack of the living room curtain and Dylan walked in, and behind him, Margaret, his mother. My heart dropped. She wasn't supposed to be here. She lived an hour away. The two of them stood in the hallway, speaking in hushed voices that didn't sound like greetings. I slipped my phone into record mode and stayed perfectly still. Are you sure she doesn't suspect? Margaret asked. Not a clue, Dylan said, his tone low but confident. She's too busy worrying about getting another job. It's perfect. By the time she realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. My throat went dry. Too late for what? Margaret's heels clicked softly on the tile. Good. We can't afford for her to get in the way now. Once she signs the sale papers for the house, everything will move fast. She'll sign, Dylan said. She thinks I'm helping her look for work. I've already told her we might need to refinance. I'll make her think it's for the mortgage. My hand covered my mouth. The house, my house, the only thing we'd built together, and he was planning to sell it out from under me. But Margaret wasn't finished. And the other matter? She asked. The evidence? Yes. Dylan exhaled, like he was proud of what he was about to say. Sophie's helping with that. She's setting up fake emails from a dummy account, messages that make it look like Grace has been leaking company files to a competitor. Once it's all printed, I'll find them on her laptop. Combine that with some photos, and she'll look guilty as hell. I felt the blood drain from my face. They were building a trap, a legal one. Not just emotional betrayal, but total destruction. Margaret hummed approvingly. Good. That'll give you grounds to file. She won't get a dime. We'll keep the house, the savings, everything your father left. And Sophie? Dylan asked, almost casually. She's agreed to move in once the divorce is done. She says the baby's mine. I'm not sure, but it doesn't matter. People will believe it. My vision blurred. I gripped the arm of the couch, forcing myself to stay silent. I wanted to scream, to burst into the hallway and claw the smug certainty off their faces. But instinct told me something else. Don't react. Not yet, let them talk. Let them think they've won. Margaret's voice softened, like she was proud of her son. You've always been clever, Dylan. Just like your father. You deserve better than that timid little thing. I never understood why you married her. He laughed under his breath. Neither do I, anymore. She's predictable. Sweet. Easy to manipulate. The words landed like bullets. Slow and deliberate, every kindness I'd shown him, every meal cooked, every late night talk. Every sacrifice I'd made, twisted into a weapon he'd used against me. When they finally left, I sat frozen for a long time, listening to the sound of their footsteps fade down the driveway. Then the car door slammed, and silence filled the house again. It wasn't the silence of peace anymore. It was the silence before war. I stood up slowly, my body trembling. My mind was racing too fast to cry. I went to Dylan's office and looked around. Everything suddenly felt foreign: the books, the photos, the framed degree. Artifacts of a man I thought I knew. On his desk sat a folder labeled House Agreement, Draft. I opened it carefully. Inside were papers that would transfer ownership of the house solely to him once I consented. My name was already typed in the signature block. All he needed was my signature. My hands shook as I took photos of every page. Then I opened the drawer. That's when I saw the second phone. The one he kept hidden. The lock screen flashed with a message: Sophie, can't wait to finally be together. He'll never know. I nearly laughed, bitterly, quietly. The irony was sharp enough to taste. I spent the rest of that afternoon in a trance. I transferred money from our joint account into a separate one under my name, just enough to cover a lawyer, rent, and living costs if everything went wrong. I backed up emails, documents, even our home security footage. By the time Dylan came home, I had erased every trace of what I discovered. I reheated dinner, smiled, and asked about his day. He told me about stress at work, about dealing with idiots, and how things would be better soon. I nodded. I'm sure they will. Inside, something in me shifted. I realized I wasn't scared anymore, because the moment you see betrayal with your own eyes, the worst part isn't the pain, it's the clarity. I wasn't his victim anymore. I was his storm, waiting for the right time to break. That night, when he fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. His breathing was steady, peaceful, oblivious. The man plotting my ruin was sleeping inches from me, his hand draped over the blanket like it still had a claim on my life. I whispered into the dark, "You think I'm predictable, Dylan? You have no idea what I'm capable of." And for the first time since everything began, I wasn't afraid of losing him. I was afraid of what I'd do when he realized I'd already stopped loving him. The next morning, I didn't cry. There was no point. Tears wouldn't fix betrayal. What I needed was control, quiet, deliberate control. The kind of calm that made people underestimate you. When Dylan left for work, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad, listing everything I needed to do: separate finances, backup evidence, contact a lawyer, keep playing dumb. The last item had a star next to it. It wasn't just a reminder, it was strategy. That afternoon, I called Emily, my oldest friend, the only person who knew me before I became Mrs. Hale. When she answered, her voice was warm but concerned. "Hey, you sound off. Everything okay?" "No," I said softly, "but it will be." We met at a small cafe by the waterfront, a place Dylan never liked because it was too quiet. I told her everything: the phone call, the conversation with his mother, the forged documents. Even the second phone. She didn't interrupt once. She just listened, her expression shifting from shock to fury. "Grace," she whispered, "that's criminal. You can't just sit on this." "I'm not sitting on it," I said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "I'm documenting everything. I need you to keep this safe, and if anything happens to me, send it straight to the attorney Monica Hale. She owes my cousin a favor." Emily looked at the drive, then at me. "You've thought this through." I smiled faintly. "I've had time." The next few days were an exercise in acting. I played the perfect, remorseful wife. I apologized for being distant. I made his favorite dinners. I even laughed at his half-hearted jokes, and he bought it, every bit of it. He thought he was winning. That I was crawling back into the illusion he'd built for me. Little did he know, every conversation, every excuse, every lie was another piece of evidence quietly landing in Monica Hale's inbox. The day I met Monica, it was raining, the kind of cold, relentless rain that made Seattle feel like a confession booth. Her office smelled of coffee and expensive ink. She looked up from her desk, her eyes sharp but kind. "You're Grace Hale," she said. "Emily told me you might call. Sit down." I did. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the tension in my body start to loosen. I handed her the folder, printouts of emails, screenshots, photos, recordings. She skimmed through them quickly, then leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said, "this is impressive. You've built half my case already." "I just didn't want to walk into this blind," I said quietly. Monica smiled. "You're not walking. You're hunting." Those words lit something inside me. A fire I hadn't felt in years. The following week, Dylan came home early, holding a bouquet of lilies, my least favorite flower. Though he never remembered that. "I've been thinking," he said, setting the bouquet on the table. "Maybe we should start fresh." I tilted my head. "What do you mean?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I've drafted something. A mutual separation agreement. No drama. No lawyers. We can end things peacefully. I took the envelope slowly, pretending to hesitate. You think that's what's best? He nodded. I just want to be fair. Fair. The word almost made me laugh. I looked him straight in the eyes and said, let me read it first. He smiled, relieved. Of course. Take your time. As soon as he left the room, I photographed every page and sent them to Monica. Her reply came within minutes. Monica, he's trying to get you to sign away your claim to the house. Do not sign anything. We'll handle this legally. I typed back a single line, let's do it. Over the next few days, I let Dylan believe he'd won. I even told him I was considering signing the agreement. I could see the smugness in his smile, the way he stood taller, more confident. He started whistling again in the mornings. He didn't notice that I'd moved some of my clothes to Emily's apartment. Or that the family photo from our wedding was no longer on the mantle. He was too busy planning his new life with Sophie, when the summons finally came, hand-delivered by a court officer. Dylan's face turned pale. He turned to me, eyes wide, confusion morphing into anger. What the hell is this? I sipped my coffee calmly. Divorce papers. He slammed the envelope onto the table. You think you can blindside me like this? I met his fury with quiet precision. I think I just did. He paced the kitchen, his hands raking through his hair. You can't prove anything, Grace. You'll walk away with nothing. Funny, I said, standing up. That's exactly what you told your mother I'd do. The color drained from his face. How? Don't worry, I said, picking up my coat. You'll find out in court. Monica Hale will explain it better than I can. The day of the hearing, I wore the same gray blazer I'd worn to my first job interview. It wasn't flashy, but it made me feel steady, like I'd come full circle. Dylan arrived with his mother and a lawyer who looked too young to have a license. He still tried to smirk, still tried to own the room, but when Monica began presenting the evidence, the recorded conversation, the fake documents, the financial transfers, I watched his confidence melt. One exhibit at a time. When she played the audio of him saying, she's predictable. Easy to manipulate, even the judge looked disgusted. By the time the hearing ended, it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about freedom. That evening, I stood outside the courthouse under a gray Seattle sky. Rain was falling again, soft and unrelenting. Monica handed me the final papers. You did well, she said. I smiled faintly. So did you. She nodded. Go live your life now, Grace. You've earned it. As she walked away, I exhaled, a deep, trembling breath that felt like the first one in years, because for the first time, I wasn't pretending. I wasn't surviving. I was free. The day the final decree arrived, the world outside my window was drenched in rain again. Fitting, really. Seattle rain always felt like a mirror. It could hide tears, wash away guilt, or baptize something new. I held the official envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page, stamped and signed, divorce granted. Property restored. Case closed. That was it. No fireworks. No grand finale. Just silence, the kind that follows a storm after it's finally done. Dylan tried to call me 3 times that day. I didn't answer. I'd already heard what I needed to. Emily had shown me a photo someone posted online. Dylan sitting alone outside a bar, hair disheveled, still wearing his wedding ring. The caption read, "When karma hits harder than expected." A few weeks after the trial, word spread that Sophie had left him. The baby hadn't made it. She packed her things and disappeared, leaving only a single text, "You promised me better." Brian lost his job soon after. His employer didn't want the scandal. The recorded tapes had leaked, somehow. Maybe someone at the courthouse. Maybe karma had better timing than I ever did. Margaret, his mother, stopped showing up at church. Apparently, people whispered. She wasn't the grieving mother anymore. She was the woman who raised a man who tried to destroy his wife for profit. Meanwhile, my life was quiet, beautifully, gently quiet. I moved into a small apartment near the river, nothing fancy. Just sunlight, space, and the sound of water against the docks. The first night, I sat on the floor among unpacked boxes, eating takeout straight from the container, and realized I was smiling for no reason at all. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was peace, the kind of peace that doesn't need witnesses. In the weeks that followed, I rediscovered things I'd forgotten I loved. Morning walks. Black coffee. The smell of fresh paint. I even took a part-time design project, a small cafe renovation, something that reminded me why I fell in love with interiors in the first place. The owner, an older woman named Nora, asked if I wanted to add something personal to the decor. I thought for a second, then smiled. Yes. A wall of mirrors. She raised an eyebrow. Mirrors? But not for vanity, I said. For reflection. Every customer who walked in would see themselves first, before they saw anyone else. I wanted them to feel what I'd learned. Sometimes, the hardest person to face is the one in the mirror. One afternoon, Monica stopped by the cafe while I was finishing the layout sketches. "You're impossible to find," she teased. Sliding into a seat. I've been busy living, I said, smiling. She glanced around. You know, most people would take a vacation after a divorce like that. I had a 10-year vacation from myself, I replied softly. I'm just catching up. Monica laughed, shaking her head. You're stronger than you think. I hesitated, then asked, do you ever stop being angry? She looked thoughtful. You don't. You just learn how to use it. That night, I walked home as the sky bruised into shades of purple and silver. The streets glistened under the rain. Couples passed by, laughing under umbrellas, their voices carrying through the damp air. For once, that sound would have hurt, a reminder of what I lost. But now it felt like background music to a story that no longer belonged to me. When I reached my apartment, I stood by the window, watching the raindrops race each other down the glass. I thought of everything that had happened, the lies, the fear, the trial, the silence, and I realized something simple but profound: I wasn't broken. I was rebuilt. A few weeks later, I received a letter, handwritten, elegant, no return address. It was from Dylan. Grace, you win. I hope you're happy now. I hope you got everything you wanted. Maybe someday you'll realize I wasn't the villain you think I am. I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly, placed it in a drawer, and smiled. No anger. No tears. Just closure. One evening, as I was locking up the cafe, Nora asked me, do you ever miss him? I thought about it. The easy answer would have been no. But honesty mattered now. Sometimes, I admitted. Not him, exactly. Just the idea of what I thought we were. She nodded knowingly. The idea hurts longer than the person. Yeah, I said softly. But ideas fade, too. On my 1-year divorce anniversary, I took myself out to dinner. Alone. I wore a red dress I'd never had the courage to wear before. I ordered champagne and toasted quietly, to freedom, to mistakes, to resilience. Across the restaurant, a man caught my eye, tall, gentle-looking, reading a book while sipping his drink. He smiled politely when our eyes met, and I smiled back. That was all. No sparks, no grand music. Just two strangers sharing a moment of peace, and that was enough. Later that night, I stood by the window again. The rain whispering against the glass. I placed my hand on the cool pane and whispered the words I'd carried with me since that first day I decided to fight back. Being underestimated is the most dangerous gift life can hand you, because when you rise, no one sees it coming. Then I turned off the lights, walked into the quiet, and let the sound of rain carry me into the next chapter of my life. I used to think strength meant never breaking, never crying, never showing weakness, but the truth is, strength is the quiet decision to get up, even when no one's watching. It's waking up alone in a bed that used to be shared and realizing you don't feel empty anymore. It's choosing peace over revenge. It's forgiving yourself for the years you spent trying to be enough for someone who didn't deserve you. A few months after the divorce, I started journaling again. At first, it felt awkward, my handwriting shaky, my thoughts tangled. But every night, I'd light a candle, sit by the window, and write a single sentence. Today, I didn't let fear make my decisions. Some days, that was the only victory I had. But it was mine. The rain outside became a comfort. The same rain that once soaked my tears now felt like rhythm, a heartbeat that belonged to the city and to me. Seattle has a way of teaching you patience. It rains without apology, and yet, things still bloom. One morning, as I walked to work, I passed a woman crying on a park bench. She was on the phone, whispering, I don't know what to do. He lied to me. For a moment, I almost kept walking. But something in her voice, that mixture of disbelief and exhaustion, stopped me. I walked over, offered her a tissue, and sat down beside her. We didn't talk about the details. We didn't need to. Sometimes, the simple act of being seen is enough to stop a person from falling apart. When she finally looked at me and said, thank you, I realized I didn't need to tell her my story. My presence was the story. That evening, I came home to find a small package at my door, no name, no return address. Inside was a silver bracelet with an engraving, to the woman who rose again. There was no note, but I knew who it was from. Emily. I slipped it onto my wrist and laughed quietly. It wasn't flashy, but it was perfect, a symbol of survival, of friendship, of a life reclaimed. Sometimes I think about Dylan. Not often, and not with anger. More like remembering an old movie you once watched too many times. You know every line, every mistake, every ending. But it doesn't hurt anymore. I used to wonder how someone could destroy what they claimed to love. Now I understand, people can only love others as deeply as they love themselves. Dylan didn't know how to love himself without control, without winning. And I was once addicted to being the one who saved him. Both of us were wrong. I visit my parents on Sundays now. They used to worry about me living alone, but after the trial, I think they finally saw what I was made of. Last week, my father hugged me and said, you remind me of your grandmother. She never stayed down for long. It was the kindest compliment I'd heard in years. Sometimes at night, I read back through my old journal entries, from those first few chaotic months. The pain, the anger, the disbelief. Then I flip to the most recent pages, where the sentences are shorter, steadier. I laughed today. I designed a space that feels like home. I'm not scared anymore. Healing isn't dramatic. It's slow, quiet, often invisible. It's like watching the rain clean the streets after a storm, messy at first, but somehow necessary. One Sunday evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and whispered the words that had followed me from beginning to end, words that weren't a curse anymore, but a crown. Being underestimated is the most dangerous gift life can hand you. Because when people expect you to crumble, your silence becomes power. Your calm becomes strategy. And your comeback, your quiet, unstoppable comeback, becomes poetry. That night, I closed my journal, blew out the candle, and let the soft hum of Seattle rain fill the room. For once, there was no ache, no bitterness, no ghosts left to haunt me. Just me, whole, unafraid, alive, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough.